Hello, and welcome to the PHRC Raising the Standard. Today's show is brought to you by the Paducah Human Rights Commission in the award-winning City of Paducah, Kentucky. I am your host, Gary Reese. I'm very happy to have a co-host with us today, fellow Paducah Human Rights Commissioner Kelsey Couch.
Hi.
And today's topic is child abuse, and we're very happy to have our special guest today. She is the Director of Child Watch, Lee Emmons. Welcome, Ms. Emmons.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
All right. I want to talk with you just a little bit about the mission of your agency here in just a moment, but I want to start off by trying to narrow down the term child abuse. We know that, generally speaking, thousands of children each year are victims of child abuse, and that abuse is such a broad term. Can you help us kind of narrow that down and tell us a little bit about the types of abuse cases that you see during a year's time?
Yes, absolutely. Child abuse is the maltreatment of a child by a parent or someone in a caregiver position. And there are specific types of child maltreatment or abuse, and those include neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological or emotional abuse. By far the most prevalent type of child abuse or neglect is neglect. And we were talking a little bit earlier, I feel like it's always important to point out that neglect, even though it may not be as offensive to us, to the general person in society, as some other words, don't ever be fooled thinking that neglect is not a serious issue. Neglect very often results in long-term emotional effects for a child, can result in death. When you talk about not having food, not being supervised, not being properly clothed or cared for, all of those issues are neglect, and it is a very serious issue and makes up, it varies somewhat depending on what research you look at, but makes up 80 to 90% of all cases of child abuse, and that certainly is true in our area.
Okay. Well, tell us more specifically what the mission of your agency, Child Watch, actually is.
Okay. Child Watch Counseling and Advocacy Center, we celebrated its 30th year last year in existence, always with the overriding goal of preventing and treating child abuse. We want to prevent child abuse whenever possible, and when child abuse has occurred, to treat the child so the healing process can begin. Recently, not too long ago, we expanded our official mission statement to include a little more focus on cultivating, nurturing families and family stability, because it's so important to not just see the child as an island, but to look at the child's environment and the people who are caring for that child and in the home with that child. And so we are focusing a little more on the whole family as well. Last year, Child Watch served a total of slightly more than 200 primary victims of child abuse, that is children, and slightly more than that in the number of caregivers. So whether those were biological parents, foster parents, relative caring for a child, we really also focus on bringing them into the role of helping that child overcome what he or she has experienced, which very often result in emotional issues and behavior problems and attachment disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder, and how to parent that child and to provide the help that family may need to reach stability.
Okay. In Kentucky, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier when you're talking about maltreatment, in Kentucky the statutes provide statutes for child criminal abuse and sexual abuse. So I want to ask you just a little bit about criminal abuse first. Criminal abuse, of course, the range of penalty as far as punishment can get up as high as 10 years. That obviously does not account or take into account if a person's charged with assault or maybe even a homicide, but just the criminal abuse alone can get up to 10 years for things like torture, cruel confinement, and those types of things. Do you actually see those types of cases in this area?
We do. I would love to say no, we don't, but we often do. And if Child Watch specifically is involved in such a case, there would be one of a couple ways we would be involved. One would be through our CASA program. CASA is Court-Appointed Special Advocates, a national program which locally it operates under the umbrella of Child Watch, and those are volunteer advocates, supervised and trained by staff who look out for the best interest of a child in family court. So we're not involved in criminal court, but certainly where a criminal court case may have occurred, then there's an advocate making sure that child isn't sort of lost in the system.
Right.
And the volunteer advocate has no other objective. They don't work for any agency or any one person. They work for the child,
Right.
and ultimately for the judge to help the judge make the best decision for what is in the best interest of that child.
Right.
Another way we may have some involvement is that some of our children who come for counseling are coming because of trauma they experienced previously. So they're removed from that situation, preferably, and certainly most likely if they're coming to us. We help treat non-offending caregivers. We treat the child and non-offending caregivers. We don't treat the offender. But sometimes the type of situation you described may have occurred by a non-custodial parent, may have occurred by a boyfriend of mom, or someone else in a caregiving capacity for the child. And very often a child who has experienced some of the torture or
Right.
confinement, some very serious things that you mentioned, will almost certainly have post-traumatic stress disorder, will have a variety of issues that won't just go away.
Right.
They need professional help so that they can learn to cope, how to manage those issues, and live a normal, healthy, productive life.
Right. And that's why your agency is so important.
Absolutely.
Right. On the other side of the coin, as far as abuse, we have sexual abuse. And of course, in Kentucky, the statutes provides penalties for anything from touching, improperly touching a child, all the way up to rape and some of the other.
Yes.
And of course, the penalty range can run from 1 to 5 years in prison all the way up to life in prison. So do you actually see some of those types of cases as well, and are they handled, as far as the CASA work, or are they handled in much the same way?
Yes. We do see some sexual abuse cases for counseling, some victims for counseling, and CASA may well be appointed to the case of a child who is sexually abused.
Right.
In our overall services, in those 200 plus children we see a year, about 75% are non-sexual abuse cases, including, of course, physical abuse, neglect, domestic violence situations. Even if a child is not specifically and directly abused, if they're in a home where abuse is occurring or domestic violence is occurring between partners, you better believe that is affecting that child, and they're going to need some help coping with that. And we even treat some children who are witness to homicide. And you know, we read off these statistics, and I say these words, and when you stop a second to think about that, it is almost overwhelming. You know, and it sometimes amazes me that we're not more concerned about it. I know there are great people, there are great agencies, there are many wonderful people working to help children, but you know, I almost think we should be up in arms every minute of every day, and just working so hard to bring attention and services to children who are abused, because it is unfortunately an epidemic. And I moved off a little bit of what I was saying at first, but so about 75% of the children who we see at Child Watch are non-sexual abuse cases. About 25% are sexual abuse cases.
Okay.
And of course, there's a local agency, the Area Sexual Assault Center, also sees sexual abuse victims, children and adults, and they do some forensic work there, which we do not do. They see primarily very specific, usually prosecutable cases of sexual abuse, And we are able to provide counseling to sexual abuse victims, even if there wasn't evidence to prosecute. You know, with your former career, how difficult that can
Well,
be.
absolutely. There's a lot of cases that there may not be enough physical evidence or whatever the case may be that they're not prosecutable. So you all then basically offer, in terms of counseling and services, you all aren't narrowly confined to just cases where there's charges, for example. You all do a broad spectrum of services
Yes.
to a broad spectrum or broad variety of children.
Yes.
Okay.
In most cases, there has been involvement with social services and or law enforcement at
Right.
some point.
Right.
Now, in the unfortunate event that somebody feels a child has been abused in any sort of way, are there requirements in Kentucky that they have to follow? And if there is there like a penalty for not reporting the abuse?
Yes, actually, in the state of Kentucky, every person, not just a school teacher or physician or someone who may have a profession where they work with a child, but every adult in the state of Kentucky is required to report suspected abuse.
Of course.
And there's a hotline for calling in suspected
Okay.
abuse, and that number will probably show on the screen here at some point. It is Kentucky Safe 1 is an easy way to remember it. That is a hotline to Child Protective Services. And anyone who suspects abuse or neglect of a child is required to make that call. There is a penalty for not reporting. It's a misdemeanor and a fine that can be given to someone who had knowledge or should have had knowledge of some abuse or
Yes.
neglect and failed to report.
Oh, goodness. And in the investigation process, what does your agency do? Like, do they work really close with the police and prosecutors, or how is your agency involved in the investigation process?
We are not an investigative agency as far as when someone reports abuse. That is specifically Child Protective Services, or Department of Community-Based Services, who has investigators who determine whether a case is warranted for investigation. They investigate, and law enforcement is usually involved in that, depending on the degree of abuse affects how much law enforcement is involved and whether there will be criminal charges, whether criminal charges are warranted. We do not have direct involvement in that usually. There are times we may, a child may disclose information to a therapist or to an advocate that law enforcement needs to know about. And we work very closely with Child Protective Services as far as sharing information by court order. We have access to information and they have access to some of our information. So we're really there to be a help. Our main overriding goal is to work for the child, to help the child. So however that is needed, however that plays out, is where we're involved.
Awesome.
All right. I want to talk just a moment about the perpetrator side. I realize you all don't do perpetrator counseling and those kinds of things, offender counseling, but statistically, there are probably 90% of the children that are abused somehow know their perpetrator or they have a relationship with their perpetrator. If you don't mind explaining to us some of the types of perpetrators that you all see when you're counseling and it's helping these children.
Okay. When it comes to child abuse, a perpetrator may be a biological parent, may be a step parent, or what we call a paramour, a boyfriend or girlfriend of a parent caring for the child. And then when it comes to sexual abuse specifically, a neighbor, someone who worked for the family, sometimes a person in some position of authority, and certainly we've seen some cases of that locally with teens and with some people younger than teens. It's very, very likely that a sexual abuse victim knows their perpetrator, I believe in 90% of cases. In non-sexual abuse cases, by definition of child abuse, someone is in a caregiver role of that child if they're abusing them.
So almost always in social services, you're going to be involved in that in some manner.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And statistically too, I found this, and I think this seems to be correct from my experience, that most of the child abuse victims are under the age of 4. Why is it that group seems to be targeted, do you think?
Well, the majority actually are under age 1, and then under age 4 is a majority. We should not ever think it stops there. It certainly goes all the way up through the teenage years. But think about it. What do small children have in common? They're not very likely to be able to tell someone.
Right.
They're not likely to really even know necessarily what's abuse and what's not, particularly if it's all they've known their whole life.
Right.
Children, they can't, if they're very young, can't even walk away or get away from an abuser. So when you think about some of the cases, and again, we've had some in the news locally where a very young child was physically abused, for example. It's easiest. A young child, and it makes me sick to sit here and talk about it and think about it, and it's hard for me not to get emotional about it. You know, when you think about it, not just as the statistics, but you think about the individual children.
Right.
But very simply, the younger the child, the easier to abuse and the less likely to be told on.
Right. And the thing is, a lot of people think, well, mostly, you know, we're talking about physical abuse, but there are children under the age of 1 that are sexually abused.
Yes, there are.
I can remember that from my career, and
Yes.
I don't think a lot of people realize that.
Oh yes, the age when someone can be sexual abused is from infant to 100. We say 0 to 100, and there are verifiable cases, unfortunately, of the very beginning and the very end of that range.
Right. I want to go back for just a moment to the psychological consequences of child abuse on the child. And I want to ask you, I know you mentioned the PTSD and so forth and some other things, but I want to talk a little bit more about the long-term effects of a child that's been abused. What can they expect maybe as they're an adult and maybe even older?
A child who has been abused is, I believe it is 30% more likely to abuse their own children. So that is a huge factor. And that is one reason that treatment is so important. Mental health counseling is so important. Learning a new normal, learning what is okay and what's not okay, and retraining the brain, sort of, so that the victim doesn't become the offender later in life. Substance abuse is a huge risk factor for abused children, that in the teen years, they are much more likely to become substance abusers, alcohol and drugs, more likely to have teen pregnancies, and not just due to sexual abuse. Children who are neglected are much more likely to engage in early sexual activity, to become pregnant, to abuse alcohol or drugs. Everything pretty much that you can think of that you don't want to happen for your child. The risks are increased for any child who has been abused or neglected.
Taking a step back to your mission that we mentioned earlier, in it mentions advocacy for children.
Yes.
Could you go into a little more detail of what the specifics are for that?
Absolutely. I mentioned the CASA program earlier, the Court-Appointed Special Advocates. That is the formal advocacy in a family court setting. And the family court judge has to appoint CASA to a case. That is how CASA becomes involved and has the legal authority to be involved in a case and to advocate for that child. As I mentioned before, looking out specifically and only for the best interest of that child. In addition to that, we are advocates in every day and in every way at our agency. Everyone who works there is a child advocate. That may be somewhat related to the counseling or therapy services, but also we have an education program, which we haven't even mentioned yet, but we go into elementary schools and do a lot of community education about child abuse. We can end up advocating for a child who receives that educational information and discloses abuse, making sure that they get the help they need. So when I talk about our agency and our primary programs, we have our mental health counseling, we have our CASA program, we have our education program, and then a fourth area is what we call kids in crisis advocacy.
Yeah.
And that is simply when a child has needs, a child is in crisis, and that the caregiver or the person who recognizes that child has needs doesn't know where to go. They come to us. It ranges from phone calls with people suspecting abuse and not knowing exactly how or where to report that. We can help with that. It ranges to someone who contacts our agency and for whatever reason is the new caregiver of a child. I mean, we've had cases where someone walked in off the street, was caring for a very young relative who was sort of sent home with her on vacation, and the child had been abused, had some specific needs. She didn't know how to address them, and we were able to help with that, with the parenting. And she also had no legal authority to be caring for this child. The child was really sort of put in her car and said, take this child. And so we don't give legal advice, but we can help the person find out where to get it. And more than just saying, oh, here's a number, call. We do a lot of hand-holding to make sure that specific child's needs are being met. And often that is through the adult who's caring for them.
Well, yeah. Mentioning your child abuse prevention programs and your community awareness programs, how exactly do they work, and does it benefit your mission? Like, how does it all work together to prevent the child abuse?
Our mission includes education, advocacy, and treatment. And I mentioned before that we try to focus on family stability and nurturing families. And a lot of that happens through education. So we're working a little more on having specific educational materials for families, for caregivers, on parenting issues, on books and information to help parents. But the education program primarily is for children, and it primarily is through partnerships with area school systems in about 10 counties. We go to area elementary schools and we present information on what is abuse and how a child can get help if they or someone they know is having that experience, and also on body safety for the very young children. You know, what are private areas that no one should be touching or looking at, up to some information about internet and texting for slightly older children, cybersecurity and responsibility. And this year we're sort of kicking off a program that we call Safety Tools and Golden Rules that we will be taking into the school systems that does deal with body safety, with cyber smarts and safety, and with sort of common courtesy, how to treat others with respect, how to respect yourself and treat others with respect, at school, at home, wherever you are, and how to avoid volatile situations. We feel like education, just like in everything in life, education is a key very often, and this is no different. We need to educate children about what is okay and what's not okay, and what they can do to get help if it's needed.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. I know there's a lot of hard work and dedication that goes into preventing this and the treatment and the education. And I understand that your agency has been a recipient of many honors and awards. You want to go in a little bit of detail about this, or tell us some awards you've received?
We have, Child Watch through the years, through 31 years now, I mentioned, have received various awards and accreditations from private agencies, or like a MetLife award, for example, that I think is still referenced on our website with a video, and to more specific awards from the state of Kentucky and the former governors, and to accrediting bodies. And the only reason I think that's important is because, for one thing, it brings some focus and attention to the issue of child abuse. And secondly, it tells us in the community we're a legitimate agency. We are, trying our best to provide help and to do the right thing. And as a nonprofit, and let me talk about that for a minute, a lot of people assume we are state funded or federally funded. We are not. We are a true nonprofit. We function on grants, contributions, donations, fundraisers. And so for those reasons too, it's important if you can point to some accomplishments or achievements that were recognized, because people need to know if they're making a donation or they're helping this organization, that it's been vetted, so to speak, that it's a reliable agency, their money is being wisely used.
Of course.
We're very close to running out of time. I do want to ask you, we know that you do a lot with very little. You cover obviously a broad area in terms of geographical area. What are some of the counties that you serve?
We serve the 8 counties in the Purchase area, and I think most people know what those are, plus a few other surrounding counties like Livingston, Lyon. If we can help someone, we won't turn them away due to location. We go into schools. We've gone into schools in a 10-county area. We have counseling clients from a 10-county or greater area. And our CASA program is specifically for McCracken County, but that's the only one of our programs that is specific to the McCracken County area.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you. Well, both of us want to thank you for taking time out of your day and being with us, Ms. Emmons, and unfortunately sharing the insights of this horrific problem that goes around here, and it hits home type thing. And sadly, we fight child abuse every day.
4 children a day in the U.S. die from child abuse, and I don't think most people realize that.
Wow. So
That's awful.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate it.
we're so excited that you were here and helped us with this and helped us to understand this. So we really appreciate it. So.
Well, thank you for joining us here today on the PHRC Raising the Standards. See you next time.